This is looking at the poem War Photographer for Carol Ann Duffy. So what you'll need is a copy of the poem to annotate and think along with the video. So this is presupposing that you've read the poem in full. So if you haven't, take a moment now just to go and read through it and work out for yourself what you think the story is. Okay, that's really important whenever you come to a poem, be it one that you're going to study in anticipation of an exam or one that you're doing an unseen critical appreciation of for practice for an exam. Or just for fun, generally, not always for an exam, then look at kind of following this process. First of all, see if you can work out the story. So here we have a war photographer, so it's a job title, it's a kind of profession, and our war photographer, who's male, is back home in England and is developing the photographs that he took when he was in war zones and conflict zones, and is kind of reflecting on both the circumstances in which the photographs were taken, the effect that doing this work over a longer period of time appears to be having on him, and also what the purpose of his job is, what is ultimately going to happen to these images. So once you've worked out the kind of plot, if you like, of the poem, or you've got an idea of it, you can start to look at the detailed close reading. And first of all, we're going to look at the title and see what expectations you have created by the title. Now, together, war photographer, those two words are a job title. You know, you are a photographer who is visiting conflict zones and taking photographs of those experiences or what you find there. But we can separate this out to the expectations of war, so conflict, suffering, death, all sorts of negative images kind of that are timeless, that are kind of sadly universal. And then the connotations that we'd expect of photographer. So if you're a photographer, you're trying to capture a moment. And in more positive times, you know, you would look at capturing a moment of celebration, maybe at a wedding or a party or so. But this particular photographer is capturing those moments of pain and agony. So he also doesn't have a name. You know, he becomes this kind of character during the poem, but he's anonymous and therefore kind of begins to stand as a universal symbol for all people who are doing that job, and by extension all kind of reasons that the job needs to be done, right? So we've got that kind of expectation of the title and the symbolism that surrounds it. So we start off then, after having kind of looked at the title, with the opening two lines. So we're going to read to the full stop. So in his dark room, he's finally alone with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. So if we unpick this kind of literally and then metaphorically, if you like, in his dark room. Now you're going to need to know a little bit about developing photographs kind of old school sense to appreciate the images of this poem. And if you want to know about it in detail, I'd go and do some Googling, I'd go and look up some images. But generally you're looking at a time when film or photographs were taken on spools of film. So the spools are those tiny little canisters of film, and they house the exposed film, so the film that has been put through the camera, exposed to light, and has kind of taken that negative, and then you use the negative to put a projection of that onto photographic paper. So photographic paper is light sensitive, so it starts off as shiny white. Then you kind of, and I'm not going to get technical about it, partly because I don't know the details, but then you kind of manage to upscale, if you like, the negative onto this photographic paper, and the bits of the photographic paper that have been exposed for a long time go darker than the ones that are be there for lighter. Then you need to develop that image, so it goes in a rectangular kind of bath of liquid, which is your developer. And then because photographic paper is sensitive to light, it will carry on going blacker and blacker if it's exposed. and therefore you put it in fixer, and then that fixes the kind of developing of the image at a certain point, and then you hang it up to dry. And all of this, because of the light sensitivity of the paper, all of this is done in the dark or by a red light, because that has the minimum effect on the photographic paper, and you can still see by it. So that's a very long way round of saying this particular dark room is a literal dark room. Photographers work in dark rooms, and you know, it's the technical term for where the photos are developed. But you also have not just the literal kind of idea, but the psychological kind of idea. So we've got literal and metaphorical meanings of dark room, because dark has those connotations of low mood, of sadness, of being in psychologically a dark place. Okay, so psychological is a word worth learning to spell if you don't already know how to spell it. And he's finally alone. Okay, and alone is on the end of that line there, as if to emphasize its isolation, and the idea that this is the end of a kind of long process, a long physical and emotional journey for the photographer. And it's ending with spools of suffering. So the spools are those actual literal kind of canisters of film that are lined up, but what's recorded in them is the suffering. Okay, so it's the images that they contain. It's canister after canister of these awful photographs that he's taken in the war zone and now brought back to his darkroom, which we later kind of see as in rural, so, you know, countryside England. And the spools of suffering are set out in ordered rows. So there's a contradiction implicit there from the chaotic scenes in which the photographs were taken back to the kind of order and quiet and almost near serenity of the dark room. He's finally got time to kind of organise things. And it sets up as well this other image, this second image that that Duffy goes on to develop in the remainder of this stanza, that in terms of religion, you know, ordered rows could conjure up views of pews in church. So a pew are those kind of long straight benches you get in church. So the only light is red. So we know factually that's because of our dark room. It's the light in which he's working, but also you have the connotations of red, right? So I would look metaphorically at that idea of blood, at the idea of injury, maybe passion in the sense of kind of high emotion. You know, it's almost like these canisters are emitting their own sense of redness as well as the literal light by which he's working. And it softly glows as though this were a church. And we end up with this simile that says, okay, so from now on we're going to compare darkroom with church, and indeed photographer with priest. So if you start to consider, you know, intoning a mass, intone comes from intonation, so to speak, to kind of have that very controlled sort of reassuring chanting idea that is present in so many religious ceremonies and recitations. But a mass is a set service, a kind of practice of the Catholic Church. So we have this idea of kind of the priest giving comfort. But this particular priest, our photographer, cannot give any spiritual comfort, cannot give any sense of redemption or salvation. Instead, all he can do is intone, is to recite these three names, and those are names of cities which have been torn by conflict. So Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh. You've also got the plosive alliteration there, maybe disrupting that idea of comfort and recitation, because that plosive alliteration carries some of the force of the conflict. It's almost as if he's kind of dragged that violence back with him from those places by reciting their names. And this idea of all flesh is grass is a quotation from Isaiah in the Old Testament, and it refers to the idea that all life is temporary, everything shall pass. So, this idea that the only comfort he can give is of the transience of life, the idea that nothing is going to last forever. So from this first stanza then, we've got the impression of isolation, we've got the impression of suffering, possibly an idea that there is a sense of hopelessness here, that religion has been replaced by this kind of what's going to be developed as almost a kind of cult of kind of temporary appreciation of suffering over the breakfast table to persuade ourselves in the Western world how civilized we all are. You may also have started to pick up a rhyme scheme. So we've got rose, glows, grass, mass. There's an order to it that we're going to kind of try and look at linking. Is this the kind of order of his life now that's contrasting what's going on in the kind of previous chaos of the battlefield? And so we then move from this end stop here, all flesh is grass, after that biblical quotation, to the present, and then these monosyllables move out into a very practical, pragmatic approach. He has a job to do, right? And again, that can be taken in two ways. The job that is immediately in hand is that he has to develop these photographs. The job that is his wider purpose is these photographs are going to go on to raise awareness of what's going on in these conflict-wrought areas, to bring this to public attention. Solutions slop in trays beneath his hands. So the sibilants there kind of maybe mimicking that sense of onomatopoeia, mimicking the liquid as he kind of pours things out. And you tend to, if you're developing photographs, you put in the tray and then kind of wiggle it from side to side. So you make like little waves there. But completing that action draws the focus to his hands, and then the reflection that the hands did not tremble then, those seem to now. So there is a physical as well as a psychological impact that doing this job has had on our war photographer, and one that he can't rid himself of now he is back in safety, back in rural England, back within his arguably kind of domestic safe framework. He's kind of stuck with this tremor of his hands, this kind of effect of his kind of nervous system, these psychological effects that he thought that maybe he would leave when he was there, because he's no longer got the adrenaline running through his system, etc. If you're looking at the AQA anthology and you're looking at kind of effects on the individual, you might want to think of Remains, for example, that Armitage poem that also talks about the psychological effects of conflict on an individual. So he's in rural England, kind of, it's short, it's blunt, it's kind of within those two kind of caesura, the full stops acting there to make you pause before and pause afterwards, almost giving a sense of him pulling himself together. Home again, right? And that line break there gives you almost the false comfort, because home again should be the end of it. You think that should be the place where you get an end stop, but instead the enjambment sends you into this idea of at home there is ordinary pain, which the simple weather can dispel. So he's thrown back into kind of ordinary, everyday, domestic English life, where you can be made happier by the sun coming out. To fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. So, the fields in rural England are peaceful, are quiet, and he cannot shake this image of actually sometimes fields explode. You get the kind of rhyming couplet there at the end to drive the pace of that stanza, and it's almost like once he's started to think of this, you get that enjambment again, kind of keeping the memory coming. These fields, what these fields, the ones that don't explode beneath the children running, etc., etc., etc. It's like his memory is kind of racing away with him, reflected by the enjambment. Then again, we get almost kind of paralleling that second stanza, something is happening. It's got that kind of, he has a job to do, these kind of shifts in focus, being very factual. And the something that's happening literally is that the image in front of him on the photographic paper is starting to develop. And the photograph of the man who was the subject of this picture is starting to appear. But you also question whether something is happening psychologically to our photographer as this image re-emerges. It's been in his head, it's now kind of there on the paper. A stranger's features, and again this kind of line break, leave it hanging before the enjambment flicks you round to say, well, they faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. So this idea that this image, this memory, this man is kind of nebulous, is not tangible, is not kind of there anymore. And he's not there within the photographer's world, but he's also possibly not there within his own world, because we suspect that the photographer has caught an image of a dying man. He is a half-formed ghost on the photographic paper, but that may well be the kind of transition state that the photographer remembers him in, this process of him dying. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. So literally the kind of story of that is it throws him back into this kind of flashback, this analepsis, where he remembers kind of trying to communicate beyond language. So a kind of shared actual language not being present, but the looks that they were giving, seeking permission from this now soon-to-be widow almost. Please, can I photograph this? It's important that this story is taken to the wider world. And how he needed permission to be there for that kind of very private, very intense moment. But with the acknowledgement that someone must do this. Somebody has to capture these moments to inform the wider world what's happening. And the blood stained into foreign dust. So it's actually the blood rather than his blood. It becomes almost disassociated with that particular man, and therefore becomes associated with all the victims and all the casualties as time has gone by. And the idea of foreign dust kind of recalls all sorts of different works of literature that have gone before, a foreign field that is forever England, and ashes to ashes, dust to dust. This idea that it is somewhere else, somewhere different, but we are all connected by the same humanity, if you like. It doesn't matter, it's in a different land. This is a human experience. And again, you have the full rhyme at the end there, that full end rhyme, must and dust, maybe conveying the inevitability of death, along with the obligation and compulsion he is feeling to capture this death. We then kind of start a stanza with a very, very different style of opening line, because we are back in the kind of more superficially sophisticated Western world when we consider what's going to happen to these photographs. And therefore we have a longer sentence which deals with the kind of Sunday papers, the first world problems, if you like. 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. So the kind of awful truth is that he has captured 100 of these different moments, almost at least, and they are agonies, they are agonizing, they are painful photographs showing real lives, but they are in black and white rather than colour. So they don't have maybe the raw emotion, the kind of absolute graphic nature that he remembers when he was taking these photographs. They've been sanitized almost by the monochrome of the image, putting them in art or statement or politics, rather than the kind of raw passion of seeing the blood and seeing the dust. And these agonies in black and white, his editor will pick out 5 or 6. So the near kind of sadly farcical situation where somebody is evaluating which are the kind of small number of appropriate kind of little capsules of suffering. You know, these photographs have encapsulated the idea of suffering, but the editor is either limited to the ones he can choose if he would want to choose all of them, or the editor is just kind of almost selecting by a different standard what's going to appeal for the Sunday papers. So the Sunday supplement has got a long tradition behind it of broadsheet papers having lots and lots and lots of extra magazines and sections of it, and a certain part of English society sitting down on a Sunday morning, you know, to read all of the Sunday papers, almost as a kind of luxury there, to persuade themselves that they are well informed, that they are cosmopolitan, so they are, you know, up to date. But that's where these photographs are going to end up. And the reader's eyeballs will prick with tears. So that will prick the idea that it's a short, sharp monosyllable. You end on that K. You don't actually, the reader isn't going to be moved to full tears. They've got time almost to have that sensation of, oh, this is very upsetting, before they kind of move on, because they are looking at this Sunday supplement between, you know, getting out of the bath and between going to the pub. So the reduction of this suffering from the absolute kind of personal agony in the previous stanza to this very kind of suburban, very sanitized, very clean, very impassionate kind of art or kind of tactic of the Western world or the modern world or the non-conflict ridden world to persuade themselves that they are sensitive. You know, they've allowed time in their schedule to kind of fit in a little bit of kind of sympathy for people who are less fortunate before they go off to the pub. And then finally, we go back to our war photographer who is now on the aeroplane. So presumably he is setting back out to a war zone, looking back at England set out below him almost like a map. And he stares impassively. He can't sum up the emotion, you know, for the place where he earns his living. So he earns his living, I guess, in England, because that's where his photographs are sold, and they do not care. Okay, so he's my reading of this, and maybe there are alternative readings and you should explore those as well, but is that he's going back and he's aware that, you know, he's back off into the war zone, and yet the reason, the purpose for him, his raison d'etre, his reason to exist, if you like, is being compromised by the fact that the compulsion, the obligation that, you know, he must, you know, capture these images is being undermined by how they are being received. They are being reduced to being a kind of sensationalist, indulgent feeling over Sunday breakfast by those who read the Sunday papers. So Duffy really is being quite scathing about the kind of readership and about the modern attitude to the media treatment of war and conflict, that almost we are full of I suppose so many images of conflict that we become desensitized to them. They are not going to be some kind of grand moral crusade. They're going to be flicked through in a paper. And you may want to just look at all of the different poetic techniques that are in there. I would specifically concentrate on things like end stop on jonment, caesura, the rhyme, the metre of the poem, because these are things that indicate it's a poem. Okay, it's easy to, well, it's kind of often more attractive to talk about the ideas without relating it to the how, which is so important for that kind of close reading. So you might, for example, want to have a look at the metre. it's largely iambic. There is a lot of kind of regular iambic pentameter there, but there are the irregularities. There are some times when it's not an iamb, where it's a trochee instead. So the rhythm is made irregular. Maybe the kind of I suppose to demonstrate the struggle that the war photographer is having as he's thinking of these different experiences. You've got the kind of rhyme scheme, the A, B, B, C, D, D rhyme scheme, but it actually gets I suppose modified in the final lines, because the couplet couplet, there's a third rhyme in it. You've got the aeroplane in there, so you've got air, stare, where, that bang, bang, bang idea. And maybe kind of, I don't know, the idea that he's pushing forward to go back there, or he is kind of stony about it all. Think of how you want to translate that. Now, there's obviously a lot more to say about this poem. This has been a kind of introductory whiz through it. But if you're writing about it, remember to capture not only the ideas, but those poetic techniques, the specifically poetic techniques, as well as the kind of use of metaphor and simile and allusion and the kind of semantic fields that are there. And really do strive to say a lot about a little. Okay, so you're trying to develop those images through. I hope this has helped.